This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. If you're ready, buckle up and enjoy the ride. Let's go question everything. Back to the Consumer podcast. I'm your host, Anna, aka Mystic Pixie. So, in my last episode, I know I mentioned recording with my friend Justin. There were some hiccups, and editing is not my strong suit. So, I'm going to go ahead and do this one by myself today until he and I can re-record. And I'm getting a little bit better with editing now, so I think that it should come together a little bit better next time. So, this week, what I wanted to talk about is I was watching Netflix, the newest installation of Monster, the Ed Gein story, and I don't want to talk about Ed Gein, but I do want to talk about Alfred Hitchcock in there because something kind of struck me, but apparently it has struck the whole internet. And it was that they showed Alfred Hitchcock actually like being a peeping Tom towards the actresses and stuff. So of course I wanted to look into it. So I did a deep dive, and basically what I found was they said there's no real evidence that he was doing that on set. However, there is a lot of other stuff. So with it, they do talk heavily about Alfred Hitchcock's work and it being just completely drenched in voyeurism. He does a lot of aesthetic with just watching, and you're supposed to kind of question whether he's personally like this peeping Tom. But there's two separate things in the cinematic version of it. Is one, this reoccurring obsession and credible accusations of abusive, controlling behavior towards the actresses. I'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. And Hitchcock built films around voyeuristic perspectives as a formal device, and multiple actresses later described being sexualized and controlled by him, like his conduct being very controlling towards them. So there's definitely a little bit of stuff to talk about, especially with what we're learning in Hollywood. One of the biggest things for me now is that Hollywood just isn't what it always seemed. And I was definitely somebody who was just, always up with the times, into pop culture and whatnot. And now I'm completely repulsed by it. So, so far, let's see then. So a couple of accusations. Tippi Hedren, I'll get into her stuff a little bit deeper, but she basically accused Hitchcock of attempting to sexually assault her, being very like obsessive and stalking towards her, and then sabotaging her career after she had rejected him. So she really ended up, I guess, at some point described him as sexual, perverse, and ugly, and claimed that he used his power to limit her career. Kim Novak reported extreme control of her movements and performance in the movie Vertigo, and framing his directions as stripping away her autonomy in service of precision. And then there's other accounts and retrospectives about Hitchcock using dehumanizing language towards the actors and actresses, being very harsh on set, and reinforcing these patterns of coercive and cruel behaviors. Now, I think I've read, which I'll look into my notes here a little further, but that he used some of that though as like tactics. So we'll see what we come across. The films versus him in and of itself, voyeurism is a formal motif in Rear Window, Vertigo, and Psycho. So Hitchcock used them as like the spectator's gaze, or how they told their storytelling, to be more provocative in the way that they're telling the story, so you feel it more. Where using the voyeuristic imagery artistically does not itself say that he was engaging in sexual misconduct, but combined with all the firsthand allegations and from the actresses themselves that worked with him, the preoccupation becomes entangled with real world power of abuse. So it's really, I think, kind of bizarre. So I really want to keep digging in further on this one. Now, film historians, they treat Hitchcock as this complex figure. He's, this innovator, and his contributions to the cinema world are well documented, and their abusive behaviors towards women on and off set, they kind of pushed it aside. And I think a lot of that might have had to do with the time. And I'll get into that in a bit more here in a little bit. But the contemporary reassessment emphasized listening to the survivors and really talking about how they had to live with some of the harms that he's done over their careers. So let's break it down a bit. Hitchcock's films often revolved around voyeurism, like I said. Their Rear Window, Psycho, Vertigo, and The Birds, they all feature men and sometimes the audience themselves watching women in these very obsessive or unsettling fashions. And Hitchcock apparently had famously said that he wanted to play the audience like a piano, but his fixation on women, and especially particularly blondes, seemed to run deeper than his metaphors in the film, in his film works. His type and control over these actresses. So he had a type, and he had a clear fetishized image of the icy blonde, the untouchable in quotes woman, like Grace Kelly, Tippi Hedren, Kim Novak, Ingrid Bergman, Janet Leigh. So behind the scenes, he was reportedly very controlling to nearly every aspect of their appearance, their behaviors, and even their off-screen lives. He allegedly dictated wardrobe and hairstyles in their private lives. So he often discovered his leading ladies, then became possessive of them, is what they account of him. So some of the darker accounts. So Tippi Hedren, in particular, she had spoken very candidly about his behaviors, and she had said that he sexually harassed her on the set of The Birds and on Marnie. Including unwanted advances and then intimidation whenever she rejected him. She noted that he would punish her professionally afterwards, refusing to release her from her studio contract and basically ending her career then, the momentum of her career rather. But so the question always kind of digs down, I think, with the professionals is this a psychological fetish or is it an artistic projection? Some historians argue that this is just a blend of his art. The camera became his safe way of exploring these forbidden desires, but others think the art is imitating real life, and that's the approach that was just an excuse for his abuse. So in sense, whenever I wanted to ask the question, is he a peeping Tom? I guess you can look at it as both thematically and personally. There's some truth to it. His obsession with watching and controlling and idealizing women comes up in pretty much all of his films, and then followed by testimonies from these female actresses. Hitchcock's films are saturated with voyeurism, like I said, especially with the blonde ideal. Basically, in his film practice, he repeatedly used the act of watching as a storytelling engine, like I said before, and he made the camera an active moral, and he used that as a psychological agent. And then that overlapped with his personal reoccurrence of he rehired these fetishized blondes, and that really kind of worked with the aesthetic style that he preferred. Now, sorry, I put this on my computer today instead of on paper. I'm a paper girl, sorry. All right. So credibility of the abuse is there's been patterns. So several of the high profile actresses described this coercive, sexualized, and punitive behaviors that went beyond eccentric directional control. They felt that Hitchcock had a power imbalance. His status as the director and the studio area gatekeeper amplified the harm because he would refuse risky actresses. He would refuse them, and he would basically cripple their careers if he could. And the outcome was these testimonies shift the conversation from abstract auteur theory to real world ethical consequences to turning him down. Historians often and viewers often reconcile the work with, they say that Hitchcock's films, alongside the documented harms, refuse to separate aesthetic achievement from abusive practice. But viewing the practice, many contemporary viewers approach his work with admiration for the craft and his attention to detail and how gender and surveillance and consent are represented in his films. The cultural lesson is Hitchcock's case shows how artistic brilliance can coexist with moral failure. And that's kind of the piece that I think that I'm so interested in because I'm a Zennial. I was born in 1982, and I know women were still kind of taught to shrink and be quiet when I was being raised. Hitchcock was filming in the 50s and 60s, and women's rights were just so much less at that point. And I find it to be so fascinating that, at that point, they were probably not really worried about what the actresses were saying, but rather what came out from the film industry. A lot of those accounts probably weren't really noted at the time. So let's break down a couple of the films. The camera as the eye of the viewer, or the eye of the voyeur. Hitchcock used the camera, like I said, to show the story, but also to trap us inside the perspective of the person who was the peeper or the watcher. So you as the audience became the actual peeper or watcher. In 1954, he did in the movie Rear Window. The entire film is about Jeff, who was played by James Stewart, and he was spying on his neighbor through a telephoto lens. And what's really happening is we become Jeff, and when watching the film, you're peeping through the windows, you're judging, you're speculating, you're finding out what you shouldn't be seeing behind those closed doors, closed windows even. And at the time, a murder happens, and Hitchcock turns the audience into the accomplices. But a lot of the people enjoyed watching all of this because of the perspective. And then you kind of start to feel complicit in it. And that's when the dark feelings start to come, which is so fascinating to me. So he almost plays with the emotion. Well, not almost. He does play with the emotions of the viewer. So basically, the overall message is like, you really do enjoy watching this, don't you? But you're just pretending to be innocent. And that's the genius and the discomfort that he put into his work. But here we are, we're in 2025 now. And I just can't help but look back on this and think, oh my goodness, what did these poor women go through? And, how did society view so much of this? So before the theory was coined, the male gaze, Hitchcock was embodying that whole theory, I guess we'll call it, or theory, I guess. He controlled his female characters and his audience through the lens, but in Vertigo in 1958, who was James Stewart again. He was playing the character Scotty. He remakes a woman into his lost fantasy. And Hitchcock stages the transformation with obsessive details. Her hair, her clothes, the way she poses, presents herself. And the critics argued that Scotty represents Hitchcock himself, reshaping these actresses, fitting them into this idealized, unattainable blonde image. I know, there was a whole beta sex kitten era. That'd be like the Marilyn Monroes, Jane Mansfields. A lot of the times these were very intelligent women, but they bleached their hair out blonde, which now we kind of know in the future that when we see these celebrities go blonde, something big's coming, or they're going to portray them as lost their mind. A lot of the time they whack off their hair too. But in this case, this is giving them that unattainable polyamorous beta sex kitten image that he's fond of. And so by forcing the audience to feel Scotty's obsession kind of unfolding throughout the film, Hitchcock's actually exposes the controlling male gaze, and it's creepy on top of brilliant. So it really leaves you with this kind of odd way of viewing it. So again, like I said, the audience was basically the voyeur in these. You're a viewer and a participant. So moving forward to 1960, when he filmed Psycho, there's a peek on Marion in her private moments. She's undressing and she's counting stolen money, only for her to be brutally killed. And then you feel guilty for even watching that. Further, in The Birds, the camera often lingers behind or above the characters like an unseen watcher, and Hitchcock's own detachment or control that he has over these individuals. He very much used camera angles. He did like the slow zooms and these subjective kind of shots to make you aware of what you were actually peeping at, and you turned it turned the cinema into a psychological mirror. So another wild little thing about Hitchcock was he was very self-aware, apparently. He made it known to his voyeuristic tendencies were uncomfortable, but he used them as commentary on human nature. He was quoted saying, "Drama is life with the dull bits cut out." That cutting out the dull bits means showing what's forbidden, the private, the unseen, the things people do in shame when they're, alone. So he started forcing the society basically in the 50s, when things are becoming much more public and embarrassment and shame, you don't really want in the paper. You don't want your name in the newspaper, things like that. It forces you to confront your own fascination with your secrets, your sex, your violence. What do you do behind closed doors? And The disturbing part is how much of his mirrored off-screen behavior was presented. The treatment of the actresses, and especially Tippi Hedren, who's the one that's mentioned the most, suggests that he wasn't just exploring these themes; he was actually living them out. His art blurred the line between the exploration psychologically and that personal path of what he wanted, of his desires. So, I mean, it's really interesting to look at it as a paradox of, is he this genius filmmaker? Did he revolutionize this sense of using psychology in cinema? Or is he a deeply flawed man? He projected his own obsessions, sometimes at others' expenses through the film, but, maybe it's both. So, again, we talked about the point of staging. He prolonged the shots, the telephoto lenses, he framed windows, forced alignment with the watching subject so the audience inherits the perspective. And editing tenses up this forbidden sight, turning the act of looking into this pleasurable transgression as an act. And close-ups and camera movements that follow a watcher creates empathy for morally compromised figures. It softens up the resistance to their actions and makes you feel more compassion towards them. So some of the ones, again, through Rear Window, the apartment block is a series of peepholes. They structurally limit viewpoints, and Hitchcock makes spectators complicit in spectating through this moral judgment too. In Vertigo, the remake sequence, it literalizes the objectification. The camera teaches the viewer to admire the transformation and then asks whether that admiration is ethical. In Psycho, intimacy becomes a trap. Voyeurism precedes violence so that the viewer must reckon with guilt for taking pleasure in the private moments. And then that leads to the harm. And then The Birds, the omniscient, often dispassionate camera becomes an impersonal watcher, implying the universe that looks on without intervening. And that allows the viewer to feel that. So as far as this whole male gaze, things like that, I know that a lot have speculated that he orchestrates what he sees and how the models are to look, which complicates the admiration for his craft and his unethical unease about this power and control that he's showing off. Through art and psychology, this is kind of the maker of life. So formal reflection on the psyche, his reoccurring obsession, this blonde ideal, transformation, surveillance state, function as thematic through lines that read as personal preoccupations. With real-world effects, documented on-screen coercion and manipulative behavior towards the actresses deepen that moral problem. The film integrates voyeurism even as their production could reproduce it. And critical stance, acknowledging technical mastery needs to not absolve moral harm, but it can be true simultaneously. So if you watch Hitchcock now, and you're going to go in and watch any of the movies, things to kind of keep in mind are: watch his attention to his point of view and the editing choices that compel the identification. Notice how pleasure and moral judgment are staged together, then ask whose pleasure it's being prioritized. And most of the time, it's the watcher. Separate aesthetic achievement from ethical appraisal. Admire the craft, but integrate consequences. And use the film as prompts for broader conversations about consent, power, and representation in filmmaking. So, watching these movies, they were brilliant at the time and whatnot, but you can certainly use them now to build upon and to actually, I think grow as humans. So some other things that Hitchcock has said. So one, always make the audience suffer as much as possible. And that was about the suspense and the spectatorship. And then suspense is like a woman. The more left to the imagination, the more the excitement. That was a mid-century remark about how he gendered his metaphors, especially with women. Another, I have already mentioned, but drama is life with the dull bits cut out. And that's one of his most favorite lines, but it's basically cited as justification for you getting to view the forbidden behaviors and the secret time, your alone time. So a couple testimonies that I had found: Tippi Hedren, She was talking about working with him in the 1960s, and it was sexual. She said it was sexual, it was perverse, and it was ugly, and I couldn't have been more shocked or repulsed. She recollected Hitchcock telling her, if you leave, I'll ruin your career. She was bound by a contract, and she was effectively trapped in this mental prison while she had to work with him as, the director, and she was blocked from working with other directors then. Kim Novak on Vertigo, she stated, he was very exact in telling me exactly what to do, how to move, where to stand. She described it as stripping her of her autonomy in the name of precision. So the why these matter is Hitchcock's own quips about suspense and women often sound witty on the surface, but when you look back in hindsight, they echo the controlling dynamics that these actresses later came forward and explained and expressed. The actresses' recollections given decades later about their 50s and 60s experience show how his private behavior mirrored the themes of control and voyeurism that he presented in the films. So, a couple contemporary reviews and reactions. In 1954, on Rear Window, the New York Times critic Bosley Crowther praised it as a fascinating exercise in voyeurism, noting how Hitchcock makes the audience a peeping Tom by forcing us to share Jeff's perspective. So the quote was, makes the audience a peeping Tom, was in quotes. So, and then the Saturday Review wrote that the film, in quotes, turns the moviegoer into an accessory to spying. So this was a highlight to the discomfort of enjoying what we shouldn't be seeing that voyeuristic behavior, what's behind closed doors. So the Observer UK, when they did a review for Psycho in 1960, remarked that Hitchcock has made us voyeurs of a girl's most private moments, only to punish us with her shocking death. And American critics were divided. So some called it a cheap trick. Others really admired how implicated the audience in Marion's vulnerability were. So there was a whole, U.S. was completely split on this one. Now, on Vertigo in 1958, French critics in Cahiers de Cinéma, who later canonized Hitchcock as an auteur, described it as, in quotes, a study of obsession and control. Another note from Francois Truffaut, noting that Scotty's remaking of Judy was, in quotes, the director's own fantasy of molding his actresses. Now, U.S. reviews of Vertigo in 58 were a little cooler at the time. They called the movie slow, and then it was also described as morbid. But even then, a lot of notations were put out about the unsettling fixation on the transformation and possession. So, let's see. Now that we know a lot about Hollywood now, when you look at how Hitchcock's films would have had some sort of grip or some sort of effect of how movies normalize voyeurism now, if you look at on screen, they made the voyeurism an engine of suspense in Rear Window and Psycho, those kind of movies. Hitchcock didn't just show the peeping, you made the audience enjoy the peeping. They felt it. Critics at the time even praised that as clever artistry, calling Rear Window a fascinating exercise in voyeurism. And this turned invasive into stylish cinematic tricks, so it was used moving forward. Now, off screen, Hitchcock was celebrated as a genius, but his controlling behavior towards actresses was often excused as him being eccentric, or that just being how his method of directing. And the studio system reinforced it. They allowed powerful men to blur that line between art and abuse. And also, overall, it had this normalization effect. The combination of the audience complicity, we liked the thrill of watching. The industry silences, the studio protects the director, and created a culture where predatory behavior could be hidden under the banner of artistic vision. Now, with Hollywood, or I call it Hollyweird sometimes, with that reputation, this kind of started earlier, I believe. There was a golden age culture in Hollywood that would have been between the 30s and the 60s, so Hitchcock would have been part of it. And it was rife with exploration for filming and basically this casting, they called it the casting couch arrangements. There were stag parties where women were treated as disposable. Studio heads covered up these assaults, and Hitchcock's behavior wasn't an outlier. It was part of the larger system where power and secrecy enabled this abuse, especially on women. The myth and the machine. The public saw glamour, genius, and movie magic behind all of these types of shots. And behind the scene, there was coercion, contracts that trapped these actresses. And then there was also this culture of silencing them. They lost their jobs. They didn't get further work if they opened their mouths. So they had to stay silent. And the dissonance is exactly what fuels what Hollywood, what they call Hollyweird, labeled today. And the idea that beneath the glitter, the industry has always been warped by predation and control. And the music industry very much is also very similar. Now, in modern echoes, the Me Too movement exposed how much of this culture persisted in the 21st century. It's the same dynamic: powerful men, vulnerable newcomers, silence enforced by contracts and fears, and then we're still in play. In Hitchcock's case, it often revisited now as historical precursor to this whole Weinstein area of abuse. And if you think about certain films that you've watched recently, I would say absolutely you would definitely see a lot of this. So let's see. Now, there's some timelines of voyeurism in Hollywood. Again, like I said, 1930s through the 50s, the studio contracts were often bound by restrictive deals, and they gave directors and the studios and directors like Hitchcock an enormous amount of control over their careers and personal lives, so over the actresses. The casting couch culture was exploitation, and it was an open secret. Powerful men traded roles for sexual favors. And, that came out with the Weinstein thing that, you heard that often. And then during Hitchcock's era, this voyeuristic film, so ones like Rear Window, Vertigo, or Psycho, they mirrored his off-screen control of the actresses through film. And critics praised this as artistry, but they never really questioned where the ethics were in all of this. So, like in the case of like Tippi Hedren, and she, they basically normalized her. They held Hitchcock as a genius, and they used his controlling behavior as this, eccentric behavior in a way to execute his film. And it reinforced the idea that abuse could be hidden under the banner of art. Now, Hollywood has this weird reputation then that expanded into the 70s through the 90s. A lot of these are probably things that I would see, but there was a lot of rumor and jokes. So late night comics and the tabloids would often joke about the casting couch or these perverted producers, but it basically continued to normalize it, but in a kind of quirky, comedic fashion. And it continued to keep a power imbalance between like the directors, the studios, producers. They were still largely unchecked for many years over these actors and actresses. Um, you know, only the abuse was only done through whispers, and it really didn't make it into mainstream reporting often. But then comes 1990s to 2010s, and this is when we get to the Weinstein era, when Harvey Weinstein became the archetype of the predatory mogul. So for decades, they said rumors circulated, but they were ignored and they were silenced, and he continued to get away with it for so long. And then in 2017, the New York Times and the New Yorker exposed the decades of harassment, with sparking the assault allegations, and that ended up sparking the Me Too movement. And this was a moment where the open secret of Hollywood was starting to finally get some light, and the predation was finally started to become globally recognized. So if we look back, Hitchcock did have a hand in this. It wasn't probably completely him, but he did have a hand in making voyeurism thrilling, and he implicated the audience, which if you listen to what they said about, Jeffrey Epstein, I don't know how true this is, but they say that a lot of it was power and control through him filming these guests, or, his friends, in quotes, colleagues, whatever, having sex with underage individuals, and then he would be able to bribe them. And so with this almost bribes the audience then, like, oh, but you liked it. His behavior then, in these themes, they really just normalized the industry at the time. And it continued to protect these predators under the guise of like, oh, they're so genius and look how glamorous they are when they dress up and at these events. And, you know, even further to today, a shorthand for the long history of secrecy and exploitation. There's a really unsettling overlap between the art and the abuse. So some of the cultural expectations I think are kind of interesting. So back in the 50s and 60s, since we're kind of focusing on Hitchcock, that was a big paradox for women at the time. On the surface, it was this golden age, and you know the suburban housewife was on the rise, and underneath, many women felt silenced and they felt constrained and they felt pressure to shrink themselves just to fit into this little tiny mold of being a housewife, and a perfect housewife at that. And the cultural expectations of this perfect housewife ideal, the media and advertising, even school textbooks taught women that their highest calling was to be this cheerful housewife or homemaker. In 1954, Home Economics Guide literally instructed girls to have dinner ready, prepare yourself, prepare the children, minimize all noise, be happy to see him, listen to him, make the evening his. Interesting. Whew. The other one is the Mrs. degree, so the MRS degree. Often women were told that they were going to college at that time, and it was less about their education, but more about finding their husband. So they were going to go there and get this well educated husband. They'll get their degree, but then basically become that perfect housewife ideal. So PBS noted that in the 50s, marriage rates were at an all-time high and women were expected to marry young, often right out of high school or college. So that makes perfect sense. But then at that point, too, they started silencing ambition with terms that they stigmatized women who did pursue careers or independence, and they were often labeled as old maids or unfeminine. So the psychological impact then was shrinking the women's voice. Women were encouraged just to be agreeable, to quiet and, you know, be differential, to put their husband and children's needs first and foremost. Their identity crisis in the 50s, many women reported falling into a deep dissatisfaction. If you've ever heard of Betty Friedan, she famously called this the problem that has no name. I believe the book was the Housewife. And then it further helps silence around abuse. So, in a culture that idealized the nuclear family, women who experienced harassment, assault, or even just unhappiness in their marriage often had no socially acceptable outlet to go and speak up or speak to anybody. But in the 60s, this was starting, this again, like I said, Betty Friedan, and the feminine mystique did come out in 1963 or 63. This sparked the feminist movement, and it started giving some language to what these women were feeling, and what they were doing privately. And these grassroots organizations started helping women realize that their struggles weren't personal. This was a fail of the systemic. This is where we were failing systemically. By the late 60s, the women's lib movement was challenging all the norms that it had taught women to shrink their voices, and you know it was starting to give a voice back. So the Hitchcock era was one where women were systemically taught to be quiet. They were taught to take up less space and to be compliant. And that cultural background made it even harder to resist or call out predatory behaviors in Hollywood or elsewhere. So, gender norms of the era. The cultural script, women were expected to be differential, soft spoken, and ladylike at all times. Speaking up often meant that they were acting against their man or trying to be masculine. They were risk being labeled as hysterical, not funny hysterical, but crazy hysterical, as ungrateful or difficult women. And their career vulnerability, actresses were often under long studio contracts. So if they resisted a director's control, they could be blacklisted or just not offered roles at all. So it really did have this power control over women. And in a social setting, the conversations about harassment or abuse were virtually non existent in the mainstream media. So that whole casting couch was a joke, but nobody condemned it. So Hitchcock's actresses in context. Let's see. Tippi Hedren, she later described Hitchcock's harassment. She emphasized how trapped she felt. She felt she was bound by a contract. She was unable to get a job or work elsewhere, and she was silenced by the culture of the time. So in the 60s, speaking out would have meant it was a career S word, knifing yourself. Grace Kelly, Kim Novak, and Janet Leigh, even when not reporting the harassment, they described Hitchcock's obsessive control over their appearance and performances. And in this era of women, they were taught to shrink their voices. They couldn't speak up and say, no, this isn't me. The control was then normalized, and they were just, supposed to be like, well, you were given this genius direction, you need to take it. He's the director, he knows. And also, again, using the dramatization of women being watched, shaped, or silenced is the parallel to the movie Rear Window and Vertigo as mirrors back to his real life, Hitchcock's real life behaviors. So back then, there wasn't like language for this either, though. So another thing that we need to understand is, I believe sexual harassment, the term wasn't coined until the 1970s. So they didn't really have a way to even speak up about it. And the power imbalance, a male director's reputation was absolutely untouchable. Everybody wanted to work for that director, and they would do anything. So the woman's reputation was fragile. If she came forward and said, this was happening, her career would be ruined, and she would just easily be replaced by some other actress. And then she was out of doing the work that she loved. But this further also conditioned the cultural norms of people. Women were taught to endure or be the good girls or to avoid making men feel uncomfortable. They were the ones that were allowed to feel uncomfortable. And that conditioning made resistance feel dangerous and even shameful. By the late 60s into the 70s, the second wave feminism really started giving women a vocabulary and some solidarity to name what has been happening to them all along. So Hendren, she later provided testimony that resonated really strong with today, because it exposes that the culture back then, it was the silence had to be buried. The culture of silence had buried them. So a lot of the actresses did undoubtedly feel trapped by Hitchcock, by him, but also society taught those women to shrink into those positions too. And the later accounts made them feel both like personal revelations and historical corrections. So it's something we can definitely do better. All right. So in Tippi Hedren, 2016, she has a memoir called Tippi. And in the interviews, she was noted about being trapped in the contract. She said, I was under a contract to him. When I demanded to get out of the contract, he was livid and he didn't let me out. That's what stopped my career. It was the kind of thing where I had no control. It was awful. It was unconscionable. As far as the harassment, she said it was, as I noted before, it was sexual, it was perverse, it was ugly, and I couldn't have been more shocked or repulsed. And she said about his attempt to try to destroy her career, he tried, but he didn't ruin my life. And then finally she spoke out and she said, this is Legion all over the world. There's nothing unique about it. I wanted to let women, especially young women, know never to allow that kind of approach and to be forceful in telling people you're not interested. So these quotes matter so deeply because in the 60s, like I said, women were taught to silence, but they had to live in survival. Hendren literally couldn't speak about it without risking her entire livelihoods. But decades later, she reframed her story as part of the larger problem of this whole systemic abuse or systemic issue. And she connected her experience to what other women were enduring, and starting to speak out about a little bit. And her testimony bridged the eras of the 60s, but her later work ended up resonating powerfully with the Me Too era. Isn't that interesting? So, some of the juxtaposition, sorry. Hitchcock's quips present women as metaphors, mysteries, or instruments of suspense. Hendren's testimony exposed that these metaphors translated into real-world harassment, coercion, and punishment. And the cultural effect of the 50s and 60s were quoted as just him being this witty genius. And later Hendren's words reframed it as this was a lot more of a darker pathology. So a little bit more about this whole peeping Tom thing. So like I said, there was no credible evidence that I was able to find. Maybe if anybody else can find something, please share. But Hitchcock was never really literally caught peeping through these holes or spying, but his dramatization suggests otherwise. So what we do know is this whole peeping image myth as being a myth. In the recent Netflix dramatization, like I mentioned, the Ed Gein story, it showed Hitchcock as the peeping Tom. He was watching the actresses through the holes in the walls. And while it was fictionalized, it just seems that it could be credible given the way he used camera angles and things like that. But again, no credible evidence. Things that are documented, though, was that, Tippi Hedren did express, the obsessive, controlling, and sexual harassing behaviors, that he stalked her, he made these unwanted advances, and he retaliated or threatened to retaliate when she was rejecting him. Kim Novak, said what a micromanager he was with her movements, her appearances, and that even included her off-screen life. And she found it to be very dehumanizing. And Hitchcock himself often joked about voyeurism and suspense in interviews. In hindsight, it blurs the uncomfortableness with the testimonies of these actresses. So, because voyeurism was such a central theme in his films, Rear Window, Psycho, and Vertigo, and because of the actress's account, Hitchcock's image as a peeping director has stuck with the cultural memory. So even if the literal caught peeping on the set story was more legend than fact, it still did give him that reputation that apparently stuck with him through the time. This is actually all kind of new to me, so I was just learning about that. So I found this all really, really interesting. And, I think what I would like to do is dig a little bit more into this, how did this shape the cult of the girl boss? And, what's this whole casting couch thing? Like, let's dig into that a little bit more. So let me know if that's something that you're interested in. But I found this one really, really interesting. And I just found that, the way that they tied together and there was a whole bridge between this whole peeping Tom versus, cinematic genius to the Me Too movement, I found it to be so, so fascinating. Um, what I also like to do is I wanted to kind of notate that, on a spiritual level, I feel like this really teaches you that sometimes the social norms aren't always ethical. Sometimes, viewing somebody as powerful isn't always, the right thing. And, going with your gut and knowing, listening to, whatever higher being you might listen to, or just yourself, your gut feelings is so important. And now we do have avenues to speak out, and it's so important now that we actually use them. So that is all I have for today. This is a pretty quick episode, and I hope you really enjoyed my take on this. I hope you have a wonderful time, and hopefully I have some good content for you to come by next week. Bye.